The greatest tyranny is not the one that enslaves your body, but the one that corrupts your soul into believing that survival justifies abandoning truth. I discovered this paradox during my years serving Henry VIII, how power, even when it begins with noble intentions, can gradually transform servants of justice into accomplices of oppression. Yet here lies the most dangerous delusion of our age, believing that resistance to tyranny requires abandoning Christian principles, or conversely, that Christian faith demands passive submission to unjust authority. Both perspectives represent fundamental misunderstandings of what it means to live as a follower of Christ in a fallen world. Today, I witness this same confusion plaguing American society, where many believe that standing for truth requires adopting the tyrant's own methods, deception, hatred, and violence. Others retreat into pietistic withdrawal, imagining that faith absolves them from civic responsibility. Both responses betray a poverty of imagination about the transformative power of Christian resistance rooted in virtue rather than vengeance. The question that haunted my final years in Chelsea, and ultimately led me to the scaffold, remains urgently relevant. How does one resist evil authority while maintaining the very principles that make such resistance necessary? How do we fight tyranny without becoming tyrants ourselves? The answer lies not in compromise, but in understanding the true nature of Christian courage. Chapter 1: The Foundation of Legitimate Resistance. Christian resistance to tyranny begins with a proper understanding of authority itself. In my years studying both classical philosophy and sacred scripture, I learned that all legitimate authority derives from divine order, but this truth actually limits rather than expands governmental power. When I served as Lord Chancellor, I understood that my authority came not from Henry's whims, but from justice itself, which transcends any earthly ruler. This principle revolutionizes how we approach resistance. The tyrant claims absolute authority over conscience, demanding not merely external compliance but internal submission to falsehood. Yet Christian teaching reveals that conscience itself participates in divine authority. It cannot be surrendered to any human power without violating the very order that legitimizes government in the first place. When Henry demanded that I acknowledge his supremacy over the Church, he was not merely requesting political loyalty. He was requiring me to declare that human authority could override divine truth, that the state possessed unlimited power over the human soul. To acquiesce would have been to participate in the destruction of the very foundation upon which just government rests. This understanding transforms our response to contemporary tyrannical tendencies. Whether facing demands to violate religious conscience, participate in obvious injustices, or remain silent while truth is systematically suppressed, Christians possess both the right and duty to resist, not as rebels against legitimate authority, but as defenders of the divine order that makes legitimate authority possible. Yet such resistance must be grounded in genuine understanding rather than mere emotion. I spent years in prayer and study before concluding that I could not, in good conscience, take the required oath. This was not stubborn defiance, but careful discernment of where true authority actually resided. The Christian who resists tyranny must be certain that he serves truth rather than pride, justice rather than personal preference. During my time as an undersheriff in London, I witnessed how easily good intentions could be corrupted by expedience. Young lawyers would enter service hoping to advance justice, only to find themselves gradually compromising their principles for career advancement. I learned that maintaining integrity requires constant vigilance against the subtle erosions that lead eventually to complete capitulation. Moreover, such resistance must be accompanied by genuine love for those who exercise unjust power. Even as I refused Henry's demands, I maintained respect for his office and concern for his soul. Tyranny corrupts both oppressor and oppressed. Our resistance must aim at liberation for all, not merely victory for ourselves. The king who demands absolute submission enslaves himself as surely as he enslaves his subjects. This foundation, authority grounded in divine order, Conscience as participation in divine authority, resistance motivated by love rather than hatred, provides the bedrock for all authentic Christian opposition to tyranny. Without it, resistance becomes merely another form of violence, another attempt to impose human will through force rather than persuasion. With it, even defeat becomes a form of victory, demonstrating truths that outlast any earthly power. Chapter 2: The Power of Moral Example over Political Force. The most devastating weapon against tyranny is not political maneuvering or revolutionary violence, but the simple power of a life lived in accordance with truth. During my imprisonment in the Tower, I discovered that my cell possessed more influence than the royal court, precisely because it demonstrated that some things matter more than power, comfort, or even life itself. Tyrants depend upon the assumption that everyone has a price, that sufficient pressure will eventually produce compliance. When someone demonstrates through their actions that this assumption is false, the entire tyrannical edifice begins to tremble. Not because one person can overthrow a government, but because their example reveals the spiritual poverty underlying all attempts to rule through fear rather than justice. This is why authoritarian regimes throughout history have feared saints more than armies. Military resistance can be met with superior force, political opposition can be outmaneuvered through cunning, but moral witness possesses a power that cannot be conquered because it appeals to the conscience that exists in every human heart, including those of the tyrants themselves. When I refused to take the oath supporting Henry's supremacy, I was not attempting to change royal policy through political pressure. I was demonstrating that truth possesses an authority higher than any earthly power, that human dignity cannot be compromised even when life itself hangs in the balance. This witness spoke more powerfully than any treatise on political theory could have done. During my years in public service, I observed how moral example either elevates or corrupts entire institutions. When leaders demonstrate genuine commitment to justice over personal advantage, their influence spreads throughout the organization, inspiring others to similar virtue. Conversely, when those in authority compromise their principles for expedience, they give permission for subordinates to do likewise, creating cultures of corruption that become nearly impossible to reform. The American context provides unique opportunities for such moral witness. Constitutional protections for religious liberty, freedom of speech, and civil disobedience create space for Christians to demonstrate alternative ways of living that challenge prevailing assumptions about power, success, and human worth. Yet too often, believers either retreat into private piety or adopt the world's own methods of achieving influence. True Christian resistance requires what I call prophetic imagination, the ability to envision and embody ways of life that reveal the poverty of tyrannical alternatives. This might mean choosing voluntary poverty in a materialistic culture, practicing radical hospitality in an age of suspicion, or maintaining civility in discourse when public conversation has devolved into tribal warfare. Such witness becomes particularly powerful when it emerges from positions of influence rather than marginalization. My refusal carried weight precisely because I was the Lord Chancellor, not a powerless peasant. When those who could benefit from compromise choose instead to suffer for truth, their witness possesses a credibility that cannot be dismissed as mere resentment or self-interest. The household I maintained in Chelsea demonstrated these principles in microcosm. We showed that learning could flourish alongside piety, that intellectual rigor could coexist with family warmth, that serious engagement with public affairs could be balanced with deep spiritual commitment. Visitors often remarked on the unusual atmosphere of both joy and gravity that characterized our home life. The goal is not martyrdom for its own sake, but the demonstration that human life possesses meaning and dignity that transcend political circumstances. This requires careful discernment about when to resist and when to accommodate, when to speak and when to remain silent. The Christian who seeks every opportunity for conflict may actually undermine the cause of truth through unnecessary provocation. Chapter 3: distinguishing between Caesar and God in practical governance. The most sophisticated tyrannies do not openly reject divine authority, they claim to embody it. Henry VIII did not abolish Christianity in England, he declared himself its supreme earthly head. Understanding this distinction between legitimate and illegitimate claims to divine sanction becomes crucial for any Christian seeking to navigate complex political realities without compromising essential principles. Christ's instruction to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's, provides the fundamental framework, but applying this principle requires careful discernment about what actually belongs to each sphere. Caesar legitimately claims authority over external matters necessary for social order, taxation, criminal justice, public safety, and the regulation of temporal affairs. God retains ultimate authority over conscience, truth, and the fundamental principles of justice that must govern even Caesar's actions. The danger arises when political authority exceeds its proper bounds, demanding submission not merely to its policies but to its interpretation of truth itself. When Henry required acknowledgement of his ecclesiastical supremacy, he was asking me to declare that political power could determine religious truth, a confusion of spheres that undermines both good government and authentic faith. During my tenure as Lord Chancellor, I learned to navigate these boundaries through daily practice. I could render verdicts according to law, impose penalties according to statute, and manage the practical affairs of government according to established procedures. But when Henry asked me to declare that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid in God's sight, he was asking me to treat political convenience as divine truth, a transgression I could not make. This same confusion plagues contemporary American politics, where both left and right often demand not merely policy compliance but ideological conformity. Whether the issue is abortion, marriage, religious education, or social justice, political movements increasingly insist that true patriotism or authentic Christianity requires adopting their complete worldview rather than simply accepting legitimate governmental authority within its proper sphere. The Christian response requires what I call principled differentiation, the ability to support legitimate governmental functions while refusing to grant political authority the kind of total allegiance that belongs to God alone. This might mean paying taxes while protesting unjust wars, obeying traffic laws while engaging in civil disobedience against immoral legislation, or respecting elected officials while refusing to treat their opinions as infallible truth. Such differentiation becomes particularly challenging in democratic societies, where citizens bear some responsibility for governmental actions through their participation in electoral processes. The Christian voter must navigate between the extremes of withdrawing from civic engagement entirely and treating political parties as vehicles of divine will. My own approach involved active participation in governance while maintaining clear boundaries about what I could and could not do in good conscience. I served faithfully as Lord Chancellor, applying law justly and working for the common good, but I could not take actions that would require me to declare falsehood as truth or treat temporal authority as absolute. This approach requires both courage and prudence, courage to accept the consequences of principled refusal, and prudence to distinguish between essential principles and matters of prudential judgment where faithful Christians might reasonably disagree. The goal is not to create unnecessary conflict, but to demonstrate that loyal citizenship and faithful discipleship can coexist when both are properly understood. In my legal practice, I often encountered situations where clients wanted me to pursue strategies that were technically legal but morally questionable. Learning to decline such cases while maintaining professional relationships taught me valuable lessons about setting boundaries that would later serve me well in higher office. Such witness becomes especially important in polarized societies where political identity often replaces religious faith as the primary source of meaning and belonging. When Christians demonstrate that their ultimate loyalty transcends partisan categories, they provide a model of citizenship that serves the common good while preserving the integrity of faith. Chapter 4: The role of conscience in resisting unjust laws. Conscience represents the most intimate sanctuary of human dignity, the sacred space where the soul encounters divine truth and must respond accordingly. No earthly authority possesses the right to violate this sanctuary, yet tyranny always attempts to do precisely that, not merely controlling external behavior but demanding internal assent to falsehood. Understanding the proper formation and function of conscience becomes essential for any Christian seeking to resist such violations while remaining faithful to both divine truth and legitimate human authority. The conscience is not merely personal opinion elevated to religious status, nor is it an excuse for avoiding difficult moral obligations. Rather, it represents the human capacity to perceive moral truth and the corresponding obligation to act in accordance with that perception. This understanding transforms conscience from a private preference into a participation in divine authority that must be respected even by earthly powers. When I faced Henry's demand that I acknowledge his ecclesiastical supremacy, the issue was not whether I personally preferred papal authority to royal authority. The question was whether my conscience, formed through years of prayer, study, and reflection on scripture and tradition, could honestly affirm what the king required. Having concluded that such affirmation would constitute a denial of truth, I could not proceed without violating the very faculty through which I participated in divine authority. This principle applies directly to contemporary challenges facing American Christians. Whether the issue involves participation in activities that violate religious convictions, professional requirements that demand affirmation of beliefs one cannot hold, or social pressures to remain silent about moral truths, the sanctuary of conscience must be protected not as a matter of personal preference but as a defense of human dignity itself. Yet protecting conscience requires more than simply asserting its inviolability. It demands the careful formation of conscience through serious engagement with scripture, tradition, reason, and the guidance of spiritual authority. A conscience that has not been properly formed through such engagement lacks the credibility necessary to claim respect from others and the reliability necessary to guide our own actions. This formation process involves both intellectual study and spiritual discipline. During my years in Chelsea, I devoted considerable time to theological study not out of academic interest but from recognition that my conscience needed to be properly informed before it could reliably guide my actions. The Christian who claims conscience as a defense against unjust demands must be prepared to demonstrate that such conscience has been formed through serious engagement with divine truth rather than mere personal preference. The discipline of regular prayer, fasting, and spiritual reading gradually shaped my understanding of moral truth in ways that mere intellectual study could never achieve. When the crisis came, I discovered that years of spiritual formation had created within me a kind of moral compass that pointed clearly toward what was required, even when the consequences appeared devastating. Moreover, protecting conscience requires the willingness to accept the consequences of conscientious refusal. When I declined to take the oath, I understood that such refusal might cost me my position, my freedom, and ultimately my life. A conscience that demands protection but refuses to accept sacrifice lacks the authenticity necessary to command respect. The formation of conscience also requires engagement with community wisdom rather than purely individual discernment. Throughout my struggles with Henry's demands, I consulted with theologians, prayed with my family, and sought guidance from spiritual directors. This communal dimension prevented my conscience from becoming merely subjective opinion while still preserving its personal character. The goal is not to use conscience as a weapon against legitimate authority, but to demonstrate that human dignity requires certain inviolable boundaries that even just governments must respect. This witness serves not only the individual Christian but the broader cause of human freedom, establishing precedents that protect the conscience rights of all citizens regardless of their particular religious commitments. Such protection becomes especially crucial in pluralistic societies where different communities hold varying moral convictions. The principle that protects the Christian's right to refuse participation in activities that violate religious conviction also protects the rights of others to live according to their own moral understanding within appropriate limits. The alternative, allowing governmental authority to determine the boundaries of conscience, inevitably leads to the kind of totalitarian control that destroys both authentic faith and genuine citizenship. Chapter 5: Building Alternative Communities of Virtue. True resistance to tyranny requires more than individual moral witness. It demands the creation of alternative communities that demonstrate practical ways of organizing human life according to principles of justice, truth, and charity. The tyrant's ultimate power lies not in physical force alone, but in convincing people that his way of ordering society represents the only viable option. When communities emerge that embody different principles while achieving genuine human flourishing, they reveal the poverty of tyrannical alternatives and provide concrete hope for transformation. Throughout my life, I sought to create such communities wherever Providence placed me. In my household in Chelsea, we demonstrated that learning could flourish alongside piety, that intellectual rigor could coexist with family warmth, that serious engagement with public affairs could be balanced with deep spiritual commitment. Our dinner conversations ranged from classical literature to contemporary politics, yet always within a framework that recognized truth as something to be discovered rather than invented, wisdom as something to be received rather than manufactured. This domestic model provided a microcosm of what broader society could become when organized according to Christian humanist principles. We proved that education could cultivate both intellectual excellence and moral virtue, that prosperity could be pursued without abandoning justice, that authority could be exercised through service rather than domination. Such demonstration possessed more persuasive power than any theoretical treatise could achieve. My daughters received the same rigorous education as any young man of their station, not because I sought to challenge social conventions but because I believed that wisdom was too precious to be limited by arbitrary restrictions. When they demonstrated their learning in conversations with visiting scholars, they provided living proof that human dignity transcends conventional categories. The American context offers unique opportunities for creating such alternative communities. Constitutional protections for religious liberty, voluntary association, and educational choice create space for believers to establish institutions that embody different principles from those dominating the broader culture. Yet too often, Christians either retreat into defensive enclaves that have little positive influence on the surrounding society, or abandon their distinctive commitments in pursuit of broader cultural acceptance. True alternative communities must be both distinctively Christian and genuinely attractive to those outside the faith. They must demonstrate that Christian principles produce not merely personal piety but practical wisdom capable of addressing real human needs and creating genuine human flourishing. This requires excellence in education, economic productivity, cultural creativity, and social innovation that reveals the sterility of purely secular alternatives. Such communities must also practice what I call open orthodoxy, maintaining clear commitment to fundamental Christian truths while engaging respectfully with those who hold different convictions. The goal is not to create isolated colonies of the faithful, but to serve as leaven within the broader society, demonstrating through example rather than argument the superior wisdom of Christian approaches to human problems. Educational institutions play a particularly crucial role in this endeavor. Schools, colleges, and universities that successfully integrate intellectual excellence with moral formation provide powerful demonstrations that truth and virtue are not enemies but allies. When such institutions produce graduates who excel in their chosen fields while maintaining clear moral convictions, they challenge the prevailing assumption that success requires abandoning traditional moral principles. Economic enterprises offer another crucial arena for such witness. Businesses, cooperatives, and other economic ventures that demonstrate sustainable prosperity while treating workers with dignity, customers with honesty, and the environment with stewardship reveal the possibility of organizing economic life according to principles other than pure profit maximization. In my own legal practice, I attempted to demonstrate that professional excellence and moral integrity could be united rather than opposed. By refusing cases that would require unethical behavior while maintaining a thriving practice, I hope to show other lawyers that virtue and success need not be enemies. The ultimate goal is not to establish parallel societies completely separate from the broader culture, but to create demonstration projects that reveal the practical wisdom of Christian approaches to human problems. Such communities serve as both refuge for those seeking alternatives to dominant cultural patterns and as beacons of hope for those trapped within systems they recognize as unsatisfying but see no way to escape. This requires both patience and persistence. Building authentic alternatives takes time, and the temptation exists to either compromise essential principles for quicker results or to abandon the effort when immediate success proves elusive. The key lies in maintaining long-term vision while attending to immediate opportunities for faithful witness. Chapter 6: The Integration of Contemplation and Action. The deepest error of our age lies in imagining that spiritual contemplation and political action represent separate spheres of human existence, that one must choose between the life of prayer and the life of public service. This false dichotomy produces either ineffective pietism that withdraws from worldly responsibilities or frantic activism that lacks the spiritual grounding necessary for wise action. My own life demonstrates that the most effective resistance to tyranny emerges from the integration of deep contemplative practice with courageous public engagement. During my years as Lord Chancellor, I maintained a disciplined pattern of prayer, study, and spiritual reflection that many considered excessive for a man bearing such heavy public responsibilities. Yet I discovered that these contemplative practices did not distract from my public duties but rather provided the clarity, courage, and compassion necessary to fulfill them properly. The deeper my prayer life became, the more clearly I could perceive both the legitimate demands of political authority and the boundaries beyond which no earthly power could rightfully extend. This integration became especially crucial during my final imprisonment in the Tower. The hours spent in prayer and meditation did not represent escape from political reality but rather the most practical preparation for facing it with integrity. Through contemplative prayer, I discovered resources of strength and wisdom that no merely human counsel could provide. The peace that sustained me during those dark months did not emerge from resignation to fate but from confidence that divine providence governs even the apparent triumph of evil. My practice included rising before dawn for extended periods of prayer, regardless of the political pressures facing me that day. This morning hour of solitude provided the spiritual foundation that enabled me to navigate the complex demands of high office without losing sight of fundamental principles. When courtiers criticized this devotion as excessive, I discovered they understood neither the source of moral clarity nor the demands of authentic leadership. Contemporary American Christianity desperately needs this integration. Too many believers imagine that spiritual maturity requires withdrawal from political engagement, while others throw themselves into political activism with such intensity that they lose touch with the spiritual sources that alone can sustain wise and charitable action over the long term. Both approaches represent fundamental misunderstandings of what it means to live as a follower of Christ in a fallen world. True contemplative practice actually enhances rather than diminishes our capacity for effective public action. Through regular prayer, we develop the spiritual detachment necessary to pursue justice without being corrupted by the pursuit of power. Through meditation on Scripture, we acquire the wisdom necessary to distinguish between prudential judgments where faithful Christians might reasonably disagree and fundamental principles that admit no compromise. Through contemplative reading of spiritual masters, we learn to recognize the subtle temptations that accompany public service, the gradual erosion of principle in pursuit of effectiveness, the substitution of human approval for divine approval, the confusion of personal ambition with genuine service to the common good. Such recognition provides protection against corruption that no merely human wisdom can offer. Moreover, contemplative practice cultivates the kind of interior freedom that tyranny cannot touch. The person whose identity is grounded in relationship with God rather than worldly success possesses a security that no earthly power can threaten. This freedom manifests not as reckless disregard for consequences but as the ability to act according to principle even when such action involves significant personal cost. The integration also flows in the opposite direction. Public service can deepen rather than diminish spiritual life when approached with proper understanding. The challenges of governance, the complexity of human motivation, the persistence of evil despite good intentions, all of these realities drive the thoughtful public servant toward greater dependence on divine grace and wisdom. My own experience of serving as Lord Chancellor while maintaining a serious spiritual life taught me that political responsibility, properly understood, represents a form of spiritual discipline. The daily necessity of making decisions affecting others' lives, the constant exposure to human weakness and corruption, the pressure to compromise principle for expedient results, these challenges provide opportunities for spiritual growth that the purely contemplative life might never offer. The key lies in maintaining proper ordering, allowing contemplative practice to inform and guide public action rather than permitting political engagement to crowd out spiritual reflection. This requires not merely good intentions but disciplined habits that preserve space for contemplation even amidst the most pressing public demands. Such integration becomes especially crucial during times of crisis, when the temptation grows strong to abandon principle for expedience or to retreat from responsibility into purely private concerns. The person whose action flows from contemplation possesses resources for sustained resistance that purely human determination cannot provide. Chapter 7: The Ultimate Victory of Truth over Power. The scaffold taught me the final and most crucial lesson about resisting tyranny while remaining Christian. True victory belongs not to those who successfully preserve their earthly positions or achieve their immediate political goals, but to those who maintain their integrity regardless of consequences. The tyrant's ultimate weapon is the threat of destruction, yet this weapon loses all power over those who understand that some things matter more than survival itself. When such understanding becomes embodied in actual lives lived to their ultimate conclusion, it reveals the essential powerlessness of all tyrannical authority. Henry VIII possessed the power to take my life, but he could not compel my conscience to affirm what it recognized as false. This limitation exposed the fundamental weakness of all merely human authority, its inability to command the interior assent upon which its legitimacy ultimately depends. Physical force can compel external compliance, but it cannot create the kind of genuine conviction that sustains just social order over time. This principle applies with equal force to contemporary forms of tyranny, whether political, cultural, or economic. The power to destroy careers, relationships, or reputations appears formidable until someone demonstrates through their actions that these threats cannot touch what matters most about human existence. When individuals choose to suffer rather than compromise their fundamental convictions, they reveal both the cruelty and the ultimate impotence of tyrannical power. Yet such witness must be grounded in genuine love rather than mere defiance. During my final days, I maintained prayers for Henry's soul and expressions of loyalty to his person even while refusing to submit to his demands. This was not political calculation but recognition that the tyrant himself is trapped within systems of sin that destroy those who wield unjust power as surely as they destroy those who suffer under it. The morning of my execution, I reflected on how Henry had once been a young man of genuine promise, gifted with intelligence, physical vigor, and apparent devotion to justice. The corruption of these gifts through the pursuit of unlimited power represented a tragedy not merely for his subjects but for his own soul. My resistance served not only my own integrity but his ultimate good, though he could not perceive it at the time. The Christian response to tyranny must always include this element of redemptive love, the recognition that our resistance serves not merely our own integrity but the ultimate good of those who exercise unjust authority. We resist not as enemies seeking revenge but as physicians seeking healing for the spiritual diseases that corrupt both oppressor and oppressed. This understanding transforms the very nature of political struggle. Instead of merely seeking to defeat opponents, we work toward conversion of hearts and transformation of systems. Instead of employing the tyrant's own methods, deception, hatred, violence, we demonstrate alternative approaches grounded in truth, love, and sacrificial service. Such approach requires enormous patience, since conversion typically occurs gradually rather than through dramatic confrontation. The seeds of truth planted through faithful witness may not flower for generations, yet the ultimate triumph of justice over injustice, truth over falsehood, love over hatred represents the fundamental promise underlying all Christian hope. American Christians possess unique opportunities to practice this kind of redemptive resistance. Constitutional protections for religious liberty, free speech, and peaceful assembly create space for witness that Christians in many other contexts cannot exercise. Yet these protections themselves depend upon the willingness of citizens to use them responsibly, demonstrating through their actions that freedom serves not merely individual preference but the pursuit of truth and justice. The integration of contemplative depth with courageous action, individual witness with community building, resistance to evil with love for enemies, these represent not merely tactical approaches to political problems but fundamental aspects of Christian discipleship in any age. They become especially crucial in times when tyrannical tendencies threaten to overwhelm the institutions and traditions that protect human dignity. My own death demonstrated not the futility of resistance but its ultimate victory. Though Henry succeeded in silencing my voice, he could not silence the truth that my witness proclaimed. Within decades, England would recognize the spiritual and political bankruptcy of the path he had chosen. The principles for which I died would outlive both tyrant and victim, providing guidance for future generations facing similar challenges. The ultimate victory lies not in achieving particular political outcomes but in maintaining the kind of witness that keeps alive the possibility of justice, truth, and charity in human affairs. Each person who chooses integrity over expedience, truth over comfort, love over hatred contributes to this ultimate victory regardless of immediate visible results. Such victory requires not the absence of suffering but its transformation into redemption, not the avoidance of conflict but its elevation into genuine dialogue about human dignity and the common good. This represents both the promise and the demand of Christian citizenship in any age. Conclusion. The scaffold was not my defeat but my graduation, the final examination in a curriculum that taught me how divine love conquers human tyranny not through superior force but through superior truth. Every Christian faces this same curriculum today, though perhaps not its ultimate test. The question remains identical across centuries: will we allow earthly powers to determine the boundaries of our conscience? Or will we demonstrate through our lives that some things matter more than survival itself? This demonstration requires neither withdrawal from public life nor adoption of the world's own methods. It demands instead the patient work of building communities that embody alternative principles, forming consciences that can recognize truth amidst propaganda, and maintaining the kind of contemplative depth that provides resources for courageous action when courage becomes necessary. The tyrant's greatest fear is not armed rebellion but the simple witness of lives lived according to different principles, lives that reveal the poverty of systems built on power rather than truth, fear rather than love, domination rather than service. Each Christian who chooses integrity over expedience, charity over hatred, hope over despair contributes to this revelation. America's constitutional heritage provides unique opportunities for such witness. Yet these opportunities require citizens willing to use freedom responsibly rather than merely demanding it selfishly. The integration of faith and citizenship, contemplation and action, Individual conscience and common good represents both the promise and the challenge of democratic society informed by Christian principles. The victory belongs not to those who avoid suffering but to those who transform it into redemption, not to those who preserve their positions but to those who demonstrate that human dignity transcends all earthly circumstances. In this understanding lies both the hope of our age and the path forward through whatever trials providence may permit.